working and researching in the field of insurance and public finance, especially like natural disaster and catastrophes, for decades. He's the executive director of Industrial Risk Management and Catastrophic Insurance Research Center at Hainan University. He's also the former general manager at the Swiss thinking tank. Dr. Wei will make comments in his talk, and then the two experts and Dr. Wei will share his thoughts about the related issues. The two experts will have three discussions on natural disasters, risk management, as well as finance economy. And finally, after the talk of two experts, we'll have a Q&A section. Then the rule is like just raise your hand in the Zoom. We can see you, or you can type it in the chat box. We'll ask questions for you. We'll pick up questions for the two experts. That's it. So without further ado, then we'll move to James Orr. Please.
Thanks, Joe. Happy to have you cover that some. So we're all talking about the issues that came before us. So I'm going to share my screen as a presentation that highlights what I think are the most. Are you able to see that?
Yeah.
No.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I'll show just this slide, just an illustrative slide. It talks about the climate trends before and after past disasters. Now, it's a key variable that we use for regional analysis. In the United States, it's available monthly as well as real data. We don't have up-to-date measures of things like that. So using monthly analysis to track progress of the climate arises in time. So what I've done here is take disasters. Hurricane Andrew, which is very important. Northridge, California. The 9/11 attack in New York City, Hurricane Katrina, 2005. This is the index, the level of employment in each of those areas to 100 in the month that the disaster took place, and just tracked out the employment levels in the months, 12 months prior to the disaster, and in the 5 years after. And you can see in terms of the Hurricane Andrew, that was a activity which was flattened down, and both of these areas was that attack, or saw the decline in the months following the disaster. But you can see, and I'll highlight this a little later, New York was actually going into a recession at the end of the prior to the attack. So the attack took place a year out. We estimated that the city was roughly where it would have been had the attack. That is, the city was entering recession. About 5 years to recover level of employment time of attack. Hurricane Katrina stands out. Massive drop of 30% of recovery that began, but then kind of fizzled out, and then even if 2 years, so about 15% or 85% of where it was, still down 50%. And you can see that really going forward for a number of years, it really did. So you have a kind of illustrates the range of outcomes after disaster. Now we try to track these out and now we think about what happens initially and then whether or not the effort is successfully ended. So I'll look at the 9/11 attack on New York City, Superstorm Sandy, and talk a little bit about climate change, and then the economy. So looking at 9/11 attack, we get most of these disasters having 3 stages. First stage is one of an emergency response. What do we need to know immediately after the disaster? It's 9/11. We're going to get the estimates of short-term labor costs, which came out for about $36 billion $1,000. This represents the cost of the value of the cost production capacity. So it's essentially what was lost as a result. In addition, there's lost income, job losses in the industries and lower. And these were made by services and travel, restaurants, and those things. Then we also consider the earnings losses of by compensation funds set up harvest, profit saving plans. Eventually, the CGP what was lost, what do we need, how much money. Second stage is return. This is how people try and make stuff. So the initial grant, it sounds like one of the you have that site where the construction. And you have several sources of assistance, particularly funds. You have your list of FEMA, Emergency Management Agency, the agency that is designed to provide financial assistance at your time. You also have private insurance and then other sources of financial assistance. For example, community. Now, in closely attacking the city, the activity that flies concentrated in the city, we wanted to get an estimate of the lost tax rate. This becomes very important for state and local governments who fund themselves on an ongoing basis through sales income, property taxes. And so the lost tax revenue becomes an important loss for the city. And the other thing I'll mention is that we're talking shift activity time in the States. That is, while activity at silent attack ceased, some of the activity shifted to other parts of the region. Some of it shifted to other states, and some of it shifted to other regions. So when you're thinking about the loss, we have these shifts of activity take place. Some of the immediate. Another thing that we tend to focus on, and this is getting more than COVID-19, is the effects on small businesses, which are a big part of the city. But also vulnerable businesses, low-income populations, populations of some. The attack on this really focuses on businesses. So that begins the short-term recovery process. And the question is over the long term. The attack versus disaster in general, likely to long-term aspects of the area. We saw the hurricane and earthquake chart, not really, but we did clearly see this Katrina that 5 years in a hurricane, the economy was significant. So, what sort of governs the issue of the long-term rebuilding and potential success of an area that's attacked? So, one thing we did was to, again, this chart plots the level of employment in New York City, again, prior to 2000, 2001, 2002. And prior to the attack, at the end of 2000, the city's economy was in recession. So the attack occurred lot of it was already defining and pushed it down a lot. So one model estimates there had been no attack that countered action, really get a sense of what was the impact of that, what was the impact of the recession. Now, as I say, did this affect long-term growth prospects? Well, I just listed here a couple of these questions come up with major negative effects for the city. We had the financial crisis in the 1970s, various stock market declines, terrorist attack, housing and financial crisis, superstorm Sandy, and now COVID-19. So there's a lot of factors that had a negative effect on the economy. And in each case, the city, we don't know about COVID-19, but in each case, the city seems to respond. So how does that happen? How do areas, some areas respond favorably or positive from questions are simply, do people and businesses still want to be in? There's a loss of productive capacity, potential looking government support growth. Basic model here is a standard model in urban economics where you have firms who are interested in looking at further techniques, they have, and the importance of being around other firms. Not for every manufacturing firm may operate on its own, but a lot of service firms with great benefits from being around other service firms. Residents, it's a high-cost area. New York, there are benefits of being in here and it's offered. There's a lot of factors for the city that don't find it. So residents are looking at firms are looking for the productivity benefits that are associated with being around the customers. This is the essence of their government in terms of providing public safety, infrastructure, transportation, education, and fiscal balance. Make sure that area taxes aren't too high and government so the equilibrium here very simply is firms that can take advantage of the clustered together so they pay high wages associated with that is housing. It's an expensive place to live, businesses and people want to be in. Alternatively, you can have lower places with lower wages and lower housing prices that offer people an option. But in terms of New York, it's really benefits for firms and residents of being in New England, people looking for high wages and high housing prices. Just have a couple of charts here to talk about New York City just prior to the attack and see what the conditions underlying the economy were at that time. So look at the slide that talks about earnings growth by industry. This is just a chart where the circles represent industries. The x-axis is the earnings growth of the industry nation. Y-axis is the earnings growth of the industry in New York City, and you can see a number of industries in New York, kind of red industries in the city. Their earnings basically matches or exceeds the nation. See security, engineering, management, business services, publishing, health services. So the industries that are strong as the economy. And the average out all together, the city, the nation, is rising. So the benefits in terms of wages, which in turn the city are rising. So the city has strong conditions for growth at the time. House prices, as versus house prices, starting at 6, starting finances, and the quality of life was improved. This is just one measure. So crime rate and frequency very high in the 1980s and 1990s, but not all yet leading prior to tax. So the CDC from fairly sound footing at the time the CDC well positioned. It had a lot of high school service sectors, highly educated, provided residences for high school workers and was able to manage finances. So when you look at how it began good city back. By the way, it wasn't at all fair at that time. This is impressive. As you look at the data, you can see again that the city had a strong growth. Ultimately, it did not really get knocked off as a result. And by the way, in their economic studies now, what are these so-called collaboration? So what really makes this sort of activity for firms clustering together? What types of firms? So there's a lot of work being done for work to get firms to right productivity. And then it's kind of like the glue that keeps firms together, the transportation system, and that's the question that's on every time. So I'll turn to super strong saying how using that term since these been described as storm category of storm. The region, September 2012, it was the largest storm on record on the coast, severely affected for about a month along the entire eastern states. Now, looking at economic effects of Superstorm Sandy, again, these effects that you might get immediately following the storm. How much damage was done? Exactly what needs to be repaired? In that case, the direct costs, estimates of damage of infrastructure, those tremendous damage in electricity, power, and gas, transportation system for the roads, highways, and bridges were affected. Tunnels, both car tunnels and train tunnels, and subway tunnels, and out of use from housing. A number of homes were destroyed along the coast. So again, initially, it's issues of how we should indirect costs are also there. And again, this is going to be situation. Those systems get affected. How do we think about what the cost, we think the costs resulting from that damage to the grids? Again, as I mentioned, some activity gets shifted, gets pushed forward. Activity doesn't take place now, but maybe it takes place on other. Also shift activity in space. That is, following the attack in the city, Superstorm Sandy. Some of the activity went to New Jersey, some states that are then that occurs as so it's trying to get how much and part of the unique systems, how much insurance is going to how much money is get them. Superstorm Sandy was a little different. So activity. This new field, some of the sample macroeconomic studies, when you have a major storm, how does it affect the macroeconomy? Not just the region, but the macro. So we're trying to gauge the impact by thinking about how these storms affect the GDP. So I've got a chart, we'll just focus on the top line. It basically says we want to measure the impact of the hurricane. And the specific measure used is this ratio at the bottom of the page. GDP of the area affected the national GDP. So how much of the GDP was affected times the hurricane pattern, 1.5. So that is just one measure of the hurricane. And as you go out the x-axis, you can put major hurricanes really that took place in the last 20 or 30 years. And try to use that measure on the x-axis, think about what was the how bad was the end. So each red dot represents a hurricane. See Sandy, the blue dot, in that shaded area. Not the large, but not by far the largest. Then the question is how much did it affect the national GDP at the quarter median following so the y-axis is what was GDP growth going to be and how much was it reduced by the hurricane. So it's 0% less than 2%, and that's in the quarter following the hurricane. Subsequent quarters, the macroeconomy got back on track. So there was a smaller quarter, but 4 years from the national perspective, the hurricane had a small impact. Quarter following the hurricane, which then subsequently got smaller and smaller, basically. It's not the biggest effect, but the other thing you can see is that for this chart, for hurricanes that had the same impact, we just said that shaded area. There's a number of other hurricanes that had the same impact, in some cases they have other rebuilding of activity took place, the shifting of activity in time and space actually didn't have that much effect. So there's kind of a big plus or minus here as these hurricanes come through as to how much they're going to affect the nation. Really affect the area, basically the curve of how much will the nation. The answer is that it improves some over the long term. Now this raised the question of the Hurricane Sandy raised the question which I had been at for a number of years, and we hadn't really talked much specifically about climate change. This really brought climate change because Hurricane Sandy was considered a 1 in 100-year storm, very unusual, with a major impact. And the issue is, well, could it happen again? When could it happen again? And how do we protect ourselves from these extreme weather events? So the Fed Health Economists, where we brought in work in the field, to help us think about and talk about how to protect regions' infrastructure from these major hurricanes and major weather events. Something that we really hadn't focused on that much. So I just want to look at some key elements here. Okay, so the first group of research theory we want to talk about catastrophe models. So the models in this case, I just took a sample of one of the results from one of the models that looked at 2020s. And this was done in 12, saying 2020s and the 2050s in terms of three measures: air temperature, rainfall, precipitation, sea level rise. So there are a lot of models out there, and they seem fairly consistent that what we saw with superstorm Sandy and extreme weather event will become more likely. You just focus on the 2050s and the line about air temperature, you see that there's quite a bit of uncertainty about the air temperature. But in all cases, it rises. The low estimate is 3.1 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest up to 6.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a significant. If you look at rainfall, again, the low estimate is 1% increase in rainfall. High estimate is 2%. And then the sea level rise, which was very part of for both Sandy and for a lot of low-lying areas. The mid-range estimate is 11.4 inches, and the high estimate is 31 inches. So that's 31 inch rise in sea level in the 2050s. These models seem to predict a fairly intense and light increase in these extreme weather events. Okay, so what do we do? Well, very difficult to develop policies because the costs and benefits are uncertain. The costs, of course, can be large, can be small, or if these weather events happen, maybe they don't exist at all. And the benefits can also be uncertain. There's just a great deal of uncertainty, and a lot of disagree. So how do you come up with a policy when there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of disagreement? The tail risk, the risk of a extreme weather event can be very serious. So I'll just mention three approaches that were discussed. One is in the context of should the Port of Los Angeles harden its against extreme sea level rise in the next couple of years? So this was a hypothetical question that was posed by one of the participants. Yes, we should spend money to make sure that the sea level rise doesn't affect. The other is no, the terminals are multiple to extreme rise. So that's great. This is kind of the kind of question that everyone in the business has. Maybe a city. Others are saying we need protection. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Theory, we look at the net present value of different ways of protection. The NPV is a question of what's the discounted benefit and what's the discounted cost. The benefits are in the form of avoided costs in the future. You can see that there's no extreme sea level rise, there's no benefit, there's no avoided cost. But if there is an extreme sea level rise, it could be substantial. Discounted cost is the cost of spending money now to make the change. And I'll mention at the time that in New York, following Superstorm Sandy, there was a lot of discussion of sea talking about the Netherlands, which seawalls to protect its sea line. Why not build the seawall to protect the New Jersey area? Again, this is one of the potential reactions. Very expensive and expensive. So I just find this interesting from a sort of theoretical point of view. These cost-benefit calculations are depend on parameters. This author identifies for how long is the terminal going to last. It's going to have to be replaced or it's going to long life. What's the level of flooding that can trigger a problem? What's the size and timing of sea level rise? And what's the increase in the storm surge? So these are parameters that catastrophe models talk about this. But these are the factors that feed into your decision about whether to harden. In this case, what was done was let's take every possible combination of these four parameters. Let's put different levels of sea level rise, for example, with different levels of life. let's construct scenarios and this little box on basically think a picture of scenarios that might take place with different combinations of these parameters. Put them into the NPV model and see what comes out. And the bottom line was, and this is a little hard to interpret, but bottom line here is the number of future cases where it makes sense to spend the money now to harden the terminal. And then most of these 500 cases, starting 300, almost 300, 500, doesn't make sense. That is, 300, 500 situations, it's not going to have the benefits one see. However, there are certain conditions with the cost where the cost again is not that many combinations, but certainly they are there across potentially very high. The summary was if sea level rise is greater than 14 millimeters per year, if you want to expect for to have a lifetime longer than 75 years, then there's going to be more storms greater than 5%. And you get more. That is, that's the set of parameters under which it makes sense to spend the money for. Well, the model gives you time, you still have to make a decision whether you can do it. And it's uncertain, so no probability, but there are some issues where it makes sense. It makes sense to spend a lot of money. This is a kind of issue policy. Now, two other approaches were mentioned. One that goes under the term resilience. That is, and this is important. So, Port Arthur, which is in Texas, right there, Texas, that is where a lot of the hurricanes hit. The argument here was resilience. That is, some examples. This is to think about and how what might happen and how you can react to it in terms of making the area resilient to the disaster. So a lot of the oil goes to the Port Arthur. So the argument of resilience would be things like having strategic control reserves that's ready to provide oil. Or something like that. In the importance of foods, observation by customers. For example, they were in some so customers can talk about and that would make the area somewhat more resilient. Ships coming in divert exports that might have gone from parts to the area that's being diverted. And production reschedule. Again, this is shipping to the United States. But you do all this beforehand. So you have all this ready so that when disaster happens, you can make the area more resilient. This is another approach. Really focus on resilience. And the third approach I thought about, here speaks has put together a fairly active resiliency superstorms handy in terms of building regulations, in terms of their power, which a lot of power buildings is based on power inside. Or put it in the basement, put it somewhere else. So those things are now part of the resiliency. A third approach here is an insurance product. So think about insurance, a product that areas can buy to try to give them financial assistance in the event of hurricane. This chart just shows that private insurance is a big part of financial assistance provided to areas on major hurricanes. Federal aid support. There's also charity and some other sources. But private insurance is a big part. So think about designing an insurance product, private insurance product that can provide assistance in disaster. You want stable premiums, guaranteed. You can't have a big delay claims payment. Importantly, that product that incentives upgrade facilities before the next disaster occurs. Federal government, and federal government has a role in terms of thinking about where the funds have to occur, putting maps together, and then providing low-interest loans for improving infrastructure. So it's kind of a combination approach of an insurance product with incentives built in for the area to do something with government assistance. This is an example of the kind of maps that the federal government highlight the areas in New York City. Well, I stopped that. Or I just continue about Puerto Rico. Okay. So the other area that we think a fair amount of Oracle, one of the reasons we did was Puerto Rico is in our history system. Second, New York State, City, and parts of New Jersey and Puerto Rico. So that we have a study of the economy. I'll start by talking about some of the features of this chart. Talks about this is as the population. The Virgin Islands is also in our district. Population of Puerto Rico, the final column verification. 3 million people in Puerto Rico, population growth 2009 2009 50%. Population growth 7. GDP of 100 billion, job growth is minus 3% again, US growth 6%. Average income is $20,000 per household. Median home price is $100,000. The population reached 5 million. Incomes increased 17% far below the nation. So, some interesting features on the plan. Population growth. Income growth is also the household income is fairly low. It's a relatively educated population. So some of the features here I just points in as they come up later. High educational attainment, labor force is bilingual, Spanish and English. The economy is open, it's on a early location between North America and South America and Caribbean. And it has close ties with the U.S. mainland. Residents are citizens, they use the dollar. They have been historically hosted many multinational corporations. It's a big tourist destination. So what's going on? Well, challenges are big. This chart plots and used this starting in the early 1990s to the present. And you can see that from 1992 to 1996, it was reasonably strong growth. The economy was strong, jobs were growing. Suddenly stopped in 2006, went into a decline to about 2012, and that's what makes it flat since 2012. So, reasonably strong growth, fairly flat for a number of years. Charts, similar charts, manufacturing, leisure and hospitality employment strong growth, education and health employment is growing. So there were some sectors that were growing, but by and large, overall, the economy. This is a chart showing population. Bar chart is just the annual population. Again, 2006. The population 2006 coincides with the ending of a provision in the U.S. tax code 6, which gave tax breaks to pharmaceuticals that located. So one of the federal government policies towards Puerto Rico was that pharmaceutical firms located there, they would be able to have their income tax free. So that caused a number of pharmaceutical firms located certainly part of the reason growing. But in 1996, the federal government decided to take that tax break away. It's fairly costly in terms of the income tax that was going on. And by 2006, it was over. It's a 10-year phase out. So that's coincides with the beginning of the time. Again, I can't say for sure that this is exactly why, but certainly the timing is consistent. This chart shows it goes back to 2002 to recently, and it shows the number of y-axis, how many employees were in drugs and related industries. And see, 2006, Section 936 was phased out. Medical equipment and supply sector, diagnostic lab sectors, which are sort of spin-offs to the pharmaceuticals, maintain their level of employment. The pharmaceutical employment fell from about 25,000 to about 15,000. So it was a pretty strong decline, and again, was flat for since 2012. So it gives you the sense that that was a piece of the action. The other thing that was important in that period was a build-up of debt at all levels that eventually led to a federal government. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But thinking about Puerto Rico, there's one approach that was taken, not only us, but the other researchers, to think about why the economy grew so strongly. And it's a growth accounting framework. So it's for Puerto Rico, you have a lot of the macroeconomic activity, GDP, GNP, industrial production, those sorts of variables. So we look at change in GDP per using a growth accounting framework. The table just says, okay, on an annual basis, 75. Output per worker grew 5.2%. That's fairly strong. That's not too inconsistent. So-called tigers. Taiwan. Yeah. And so capital per worker is growing. So human capital 7%. So on an annual basis, 75 period and 75 for 2004. So output per worker fall, capital per worker, the investment culture fell dramatically. So there was a decline in investment that was part of slowing. We didn't do it after that because really the situation in Puerto Rico was one where it was fairly flat. So there wasn't a lot of change that you can explain. But when you're thinking about Puerto Rico and other economies, it's growth accounting framework that you started as to what might be at a high level of the factors of it. Now the fiscal situation got worse. Puerto Rico between 2006 and 2014 revenues, and they were selling a lot of bonds that took the table as of 2013. 71.9 billion, about 100% of GDP at the time. There were general obligations bonds, which was the government agency, it's a government agency set up to sell bonds. Municipalities, cities had tax revenue anticipation groups sold, and public corporations, our border public corporations also get. So there's a very strong debt situation, and the debt sustainability situation is such that it was called into question. So debt sustainability was, and this was around 2015, lot of questions were being raised. Was there too much debt? Is it sustainable? So the basic equation here, dt is the amount of debt this period minus the amount of t minus what you had last year. So that's the growth debt. And that's related to I, which is the interest rate on your debt outstanding, plus how much you're spending minus how much you take. So that's just an accounting of how the debt builds up. But what you're really interested in sustainability is not so much debt, but debt to income. That is the debt high relative to some income is what you use to pay off. Debt sustainability says that it's fairly stable or even as a share of income, even that's from debt to income ratio. Important for the debt ratio. The second equation is the first equation, expressing its income. So the little dt is net income ratio, your t minus or plus t minus 1. So that's the change in income ratio. If you do some manipulation, turns out that's interest rate minus so I minus g times the debt ratio plus the primary debt. The primary deficit, that's going to be government spending minus tax revenue. So you've got government spending minus tax revenue, not including interest. And the interest payments, how they match up compared to income shows you how your debt is changing. Puerto Rico GDP, the primary deficit, exclude interest payments, was negative. Was positive. Government spending was greater than tax revenue. So that was added to debt. The growth rate of the economy was less than the interest rate. So that was also negative. So the economy wasn't growing sufficiently. There was build-up of debt. It was thought the fiscal situation was unsustainable. So 2015, government declared it was unsustainable. So the level was growth, economic growth required fiscal stability. Stable fiscal conditions required growth. So in 2016, President Obama signed created oversight banking. Basically, that meant the federal government took over Puerto Rico's finances. They had charge of government spending taxes. They were charged with restructuring debt and getting Puerto Rico back into the capital market. So slow growth in this kind of just picture what was going on ahead when we talk about population decline. The island going into debt, they began to restructure. There were some success stories in 2018. There was a post-bankruptcy, but the government developed bank restructured its debt. That was a big component of debt. 2020, the Border Authority, which had issued a lot of bonds to restructure its debt. So there were some success stories, but the Center for a New Economy recently said it. Plan and support agreements have been announced for $35 billion. Thus, after 5 years, there's been some progress, but it's been slow. So there's still a situation where PROMESA is trying to work out the financial situation, experiment flat. And I'll just here's to say, okay, it's a difficult situation in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of strengths that we talk about. Resources, education, bilingual population. So what do we do? Well, one thing to do is you try to be specific about what industries you should get into. And this is something economists are uncomfortable with, but if you look at what the capacity they have now, physical and human resources, the medical-related industries, as we can see, have a presence on the island, certainly a tourist destination. Multinationals have been a big presence there, particularly drug companies. They require services. given the educational population, you can be a knowledge-based service sector. So these are the kinds of sectors that appear that could be drivers of growth. Kind of a natural, but again, it's hard to be specific about it because you have to really do a careful analysis to see if, in fact, competitive pressures are really pushing forward. One of the things that was suggested, that I found interesting, was partnerships between industry and higher education. There's a number of places in the United States, Research Triangle Park in the area in California, Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, where there's been partnerships between universities and companies. And they work together to develop commercial products. The universities do a lot of research, the companies do production, they become centers of research, attracting high-skilled workers. And one of the potential thoughts for Puerto Rico was, given the experience with industries and given the higher education, maybe this is a way to go. The third area is just to improve the general business. Now, this is something that would have to be done almost no matter what we try to do in Puerto Rico, no matter what language. And in particular, our study pointed to these four factors that really characterize the environment and need improvement. One is to improve opportunities, especially for young workers. Puerto Rico has a relatively high minimum wage, but there's a lot of controversy about what effect the minimum wage had on employment. But Puerto Rico's income is a third of the mainland's income, yet it has the same minimum wage. The feeling is that minimum wage may be too high and may limit opportunities for young workers to get their foot in. On the other hand, there are entitlement programs that might help workers who are out of work, who have housing difficulties, and other forms of assistance that the federal government can provide. And there's some thought that they're fairly generous, given the high minimum wage, which is on the demand side, reducing perhaps the opportunities for workers on the supply side as the relative entitlement. So take a careful look at those, particularly for young workers. Secondly, is reduce the cost of doing business. Taxes are considered to be fairly high and really focused on certain companies. There is an argument, we have no estimates, that there's a lot of activity that takes place off the so-called undervalued economy that is not taxed. So tax reform is part of it. The energy industry is considered to be a hindrance to growth. It's a monopoly. So there's no competition. It sets its own rates, which is considered fairly high. Doesn't have a regulator. So unlike on the mainland, the utility wants to raise its rates, it's got to go to a regulator. As we said, information about why the rates have to go up. There's no regulator. So the energy industry is considered to be Puerto Rico, an area that really needs it. There are other burdens. For example, if you want to open up a business, then sometimes government forms that have to be filled in. The so-called red tape, there's a sense that the tape is too high, and transportation costs are high. There's a federal law that says that all the goods going to and coming to Puerto Rico have to be carried on U.S. ships using U.S. crews built in the United States. That makes it fairly expensive. So we argue these factors make it hard to do business. You can develop human capital, again, get the young workers in labor force so that they can get work experience. And then mobilizing finance. At the time we did the study, banks were the main source of finance. And the banks have been weak. Again, with the economy weak, banks have been weak. There wasn't a lot of finance for startups, so there seem to be some new ways of getting finance to companies that start. So we argued that this is improving the environment, and this would help everybody. Okay, so I'll stop here, and I guess we'll move on to the next section.
Yes, thanks, Ken. It's a very detailed and insightful. I think the Australians construction of the defense perspective, especially I think the Puerto Rico. I see a lot of similarities with Hainan, especially the problems issues, and we are as a Hainan Business Financial Research Institute, we're trying to work to improve the general business environment in Hainan as well. And your point about partnership and higher education and cooperation will sort of these stuff that we'll talk as well. Okay, now we'll bring Dr. Wei area. He will make comments and we'll have Dr. Wei's turn.
Thank you. Your presentation is very informative and educational, and serves a very good reference for what we do in China. And quite interesting, you discussed employment, the impacts to employment before and after disasters, and also the impacts of the GDP, the different levels, which is also our concern too, and long-term and short-term impact. And particularly, actually, what interests us is we particularly mentioned the impact to individuals, residents, and businesses and the government and the financial entities. Because when we look at the disasters, we look at it from financial and fiscal perspective. Actually, there only have three categories of financial entities in terms of money: so individuals, businesses, and governments. But also you mentioned, discussed the climate change, and we understand, particularly in China, climate change has been resulting in a significant change of peril patterns. Like in the past, like 200 millimeters of precipitation rainfalls may take place over a span of 2 months, in 60 days, but that can happen today, just in 48 hours. So you can see the impact of disaster is hugely different now. And also you discussed resilience. Actually, in China, the government pays strong attention of engineering resilience and administrative resilience. For example, the government has built up a very strong and productive emergency procedures and system mechanisms, but also a very strong engineering resilience, like water conservancy facilities and multi-purpose dams along the Chaoyang River and Huanghe River. And but what we see like here in China is the financial resilience, which we also discussed quite extensively in terms of the banking and insurance. And what interests me particularly, like insurance actually account for more than 50% of the recovery, financial recovery after disasters. In China, the contribution to insurance account for not more than 1% in the catastrophic events. So that's a huge difference. And you also, what actually interesting is you discussed quite extensively on the debt situation in Puerto Rico. And so this is also the fiscal consequences of disasters. And what we do here actually in China is in the past few months, I conducted a quite extensive study on the strategies of public finance in response to disasters. So actually, what you discussed is quite related to our study in China. And particularly this study, actually, what we do is for ADB. So ADB is trying to establish some framework, productive framework in China, which, if successful, and could be referenced to other member countries. And so my study is about the strategies of public finance in response to disasters. So we studied quite extensively the disasters globally and in China, and particularly the pandemic. So the pandemic has lasted a year and a half now. When it started in early 2020, we thought it would disappear in 6 months. But also even, we did a lot of the scenario studies. Even confinement or lockdown lasted for 3 months. What is the consequence of the economic disasters? And about 6 months containment. And interestingly, the containment, the lockdown now it has lasted for more than 1 or 12 months. So the consequence actually could be very disastrous. And but from financial and what we want to do, what we try to define disaster risks, we look at from 4 different angles. Firstly, we see a disaster risk is the potential loss of massive bodily property damage and even the business interruption rising out of the disaster in social economic system. And secondly, we see such losses could cascade into more extensive financial losses, economic disasters, and financial crises in chain reactions in the social and economic system. And thirdly, we see a disaster risk is regarded as a contingent liability from a perspective of financial and fiscal management for individuals, businesses, and the government. And thirdly, actually, we look at the governments are overwhelmingly accountable for consequences of disaster risks in the social and economic system, giving the holistic impact of the disaster risks. So basically, we see the degree of disaster severity, but degree goes both sides. So the responsibility, perception, and understanding of individuals and businesses will diminish. And when we see the very catastrophic events taking place, basically we don't see the liability or responsibility of the individuals, but now the government takes over. So what we are experiencing in the pandemic is exactly what's happened, like in the United States. The government actually, to us, it's very interesting. In China, we don't get the payout, we don't get the cash pay from the government, the socialist country, for the United States. And in many so-called capitalist countries, you receive cash payouts monthly or weekly, which is amazing. So this is sort of a stimulus, and we see driven by the government, which means the government taking over the overall responsibility in a very catastrophic event. And now we see. So now we see how we can deal with such a situation. So then we move into the state that we need to calculate the contingent liability of the government. But what is interesting is that we see the government, actually the traditional government disaster-related reserve and the budget system is very much what are cash reserve fund oriented. But the disaster risks are contingent liabilities of the government. You see the reserve, the cash reserve fund has no way to match with the contingent liability of the government, which is well beyond the reserve, cash reserve fund of any government in the traditional way. So that's why we see the huge gap in government fund in response to disaster risks. Now we see so why we should not establish a sort of a new framework. So to have both reserve fund and blended with them. So we have reserve fund blended with contingent fund, just like insurance, parametric insurance. The parametric insurance is kind of a contingent financing instrument, which is the contingent with the disaster risk, which is also contingent liability of the government. This is sort of a pathway we're looking at to building up a sort of a fiscal framework blended with both reserve and contingent fund in response to the contingent liabilities rising out of disaster risks, particularly for those catastrophic events. And so this is sort of a situation we're looking at, the research we're looking at, and what you discussed is very much related to our studies. Very simple. But also, Jim, we would like to hear from you. How do you see the prospects and the outlook of what the U.S. Federal Reserve System is doing in terms of, the massive stimulus, fiscal stimulus and measures? What is the impact going forward to macroeconomics and the financial market in the future at a global scale? Well, that would be interesting for us. Okay.
Well, first thing, to back to your point about liabilities and the role of the government. I want to be clear that the U.S. government, this FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is the go-to agency when there is a disaster. Private insurance typically plays a big part, but initially it's going to be FEMA. And so the hurricane that took place in Puerto Rico in 2017, FEMA was initially looked at. And again, the idea was, well, how much money is needed? What's the damage? And they would fund part of that. So FEMA would be an agency. I don't know whether that's similar to, it sounds like you're talking about something that goes beyond just coming in when a disaster happens, and being the first there to provide some assistance. But that's the U.S. government agency, that is sort of the agency that shows up first. Hurricane Katrina, the major hurricane in New Orleans, was a little different in that there was a lot of destruction of houses, and just flat out destruction of houses and businesses. And so FEMA played a bigger role there. So the numbers I gave you are sort of an average, but again, just the federal agency is FEMA, with the idea that private insurance has a role, certainly has in the past and going forward. And two, it's a question of how to design.
Very interesting. In China, we have statistics showing the fiscal fund contribution to direct economic damage rising out of natural disasters in the past 20 years is only in the range of 2%, maximum up to 7%. And so the gap is tremendous, very significant. And for example, last year, recently, I joined a study group of the Ministry of Water Resources to conduct a study on the financial resilience on the Yangtze River. But in China, government has to spend a huge amount of money and effort on engineering resilience, huge money in building up water conservancy facility on the river, very big money. But then, what happened last year, particularly last July, the flood disaster was quite serious in July last year, and costed how much? The rehabilitation cost for the part of the river actually was calculated at something like 20 billion RMB. But cash reserve fund available for rehabilitation only 2 10% of the cost. So you see that the gap is very significant. And so that kind of situation, that's why we propose to the government, when you build up a very strong engineering resilience, even with a pretty good emergency response measures and facilities, financial resilience is also critically important. And with the cash reserve, budget, the fund is never ever available enough to deal with the rehabilitation fund requirement. That's a challenge this year. That's why we propose we may try like a pilot of parametric flood insurance solutions to fill out the gaps.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a huge gap if you imagine 2 of those events happen. Then that fund, it really seems it's unable to distance it. Yeah, the current macro situation in the U.S. is interesting. I mean, I follow it. I think the COVID-19 response, the fiscal response, several major fiscal programs, which included aid to small businesses, extended unemployment, like you said, payments to individuals each month, those sorts of things. And it was interesting that it was a huge program, and it was one of several. And so I think the response there to COVID-19 is quite strong, fiscal point of view. And some disagreement about it, but both parties seem to sign on to it. The big debate now, of course, is as the jobs now it's just pushing about it's an issue. Right now, the issues are we're seeing inflation as demand picks up, as the recovery takes place from COVID. The demand is picking up. The number of commodities prices are going up. And the debate now is that temporary? Does that go away as the supply responds, or is it going to work its way more permanently into a higher inflation environment? So that's the debate right now, and people are waiting to see how it plays out. I think Fed, for what they say, it believes that it's largely transitory. A typical response after a disaster that prices of commodities go up. And I guess it's combined now with the chip shortage that took place, which is raising prices of automobiles, new cars, and used cars, as the demand can't be satisfied. And so there's a lot of areas where prices are going up. The question is it transitory or permanent? But I thought the fiscal response was huge to the COVID-19. And it tried to cover a number of areas. And it also included the Fed providing liquidity to markets. So if, take for example, a municipality was relying on selling its bonds, and then with the weak economy, there was a sense among investors that we're not sure we want to invest in the bonds. The Fed stood there effectively, waited, we make the investment. So in a number of markets, the Fed said we'll provide liquidity and we'll guarantee the stability of the market. So on both the fiscal and the monetary front, huge response. And I think now, like I say, the debate seems to be about inflation. But the payments for some are still continuing through September. But the numbers are looking better for the U.S. economy, really looking better, certainly than they did this time last year.
This is quite interesting because in the catastrophic event, in one disaster, very serious disaster happens like a pandemic. Through the history, this is the first time ever, we see a hike of property prices. Because in the Great Depression and even the 1980 financial crisis, see a drop of pricing, share pricing drop, housing pricing drop. To this time, on the contrary, we see the massive hike of residential properties, houses, commodities, just unbelievable. And the liquidity injection into the market that goes into just like a monoline into the residential property, and without much consumer consumption, massively just. I just want to see, how do you see the side effect, such a massive liquidity injected into the market, and particularly for disadvantaged economies? I'm pretty sure U.S. would benefit if you have a strong economy and strong currency. But how about those disadvantaged countries, economies, with very weak currency? So when the inflation in the United States moves up, just like last night, the share price dropped massively last night in the US, and also the dollar index moves up pretty sharply, and the share market in Europe and in Asia in the past 2 days are not so impressive. And how do you see the side effect? Such a massive liquidity.
Well, I think it was injected with the idea that the markets needed it, and to support markets. It has international effects, but at the same time, I think it was largely done again for domestic purposes, and I know it'll have effects abroad, but I really don't. I haven't looked at it in enough detail to comment on that. The decline yesterday in the market, the market with the information coming out about more COVID caused the stock market. Apparently, one of the reasons why the market went down here today. But yeah, it's going to have effects. But I haven't really been that careful. Exactly, it's going to affect.
Thank you. Bill?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Jim, Dr. Wei. It's a wonderful discussion, very insightful. I see relate the research in the text. So now it's time for the guys in the Zoom and in the broadcast studio. Outside the room, there's about 100 people. So if you have any questions, you just, especially for the people outside the room, you can type in the chat box. I can ask for it. So please, if you have any questions in the Zoom, you just, I think with this amount of people, you can directly ask the expert. Right. We have about 10 minutes. Any questions? We have a question about what is the for Jim. What is the future? What's your perspective? Because the delta. Again, how do you see the future, especially in form?
Things have gotten a lot better in terms of the museums have opened, the entertainment, sporting events are on, and there aren't a lot of restrictions on attendance. So pretty soon Broadway shows will open up. So New York is returning. There's concern about the Delta variant. There's concern about the variant. There's concern that some of the numbers have gone up. I think there's concern about exactly what might be causing vaccinating to be so susceptible, and what that means for the population. So I would say at this point, there's really been a turnaround, and New York is becoming New York again. Office workers are slowly coming back. Tourists are slowly coming back, and it's opened up. It's hard for me to predict going forward, other than to say that there's definitely a concern about variant, and some concern about whether we would have to go into, as some other places have had to, back into some sort of lockdown. It hasn't really been discussed, but I guess that would be sort of the worst case scenario is the variant becomes so widespread that there has to be another cut. Because right now the city's return again. I don't want to say we're fully back. There's still a lot of stores that are closed. There's still a lot of people, small businesses especially. There's still a lot of people out of work. But definitely it's changed, and I hate to see this variant catch on so that we go off track. Again, hard for me to predict. Other than just yes, there's a concern that the numbers are rising. We'll have to see more.
Okay, thank you, Dave. There is a question from our research fellow, Hainan Green Financial Research Institute. I think this is a question for both of the guys, but especially Dr. Wei. Extreme weather, under the condition of climate change, because maybe the extreme weather for the past become more frequent. So there, in terms of probability, we want to redefine it. That's
well, we may end up having to. Again, I'm not sure what the latest catastrophe models are saying, but the little chart I had showed that these things are going to become more common. We were learning, I was learning a lot about this field myself in terms of the 1 in 100-year storm or 1 in 200 storms, especially when they say the 1 in 100-year storm could happen 5 times in the next 100 years. It seemed contradictory, but it has to do with the magnitude of the effect. It's like a storm that happens once every 100 years, but it's going to happen 5 times. So perhaps, but I think it's important that these catastrophe models are giving us predictions, wide range, some uncertainty, as you saw, but they seem to be pointing in the same direction. Whether that's extreme conditions will be considered more. This results that suggest that these extreme events are going to be.
So catastrophe, disaster, actually. So a lot of debate in the insurance industry about how to define catastrophe. Actually, the catastrophic risk, the terminology comes from procurement of reinsurance, from the insurers. Because the insurers actually operate under the law of large numbers. So that's what they do. But that's why you can actually calculate the premium rate, but based on large numbers. But the issue is, what is the catastrophic event? One single event will result in massive loss of bodily injuries or property damage. So it's against the law of large numbers. That's why insurers have to procure for the cat horizontal access to loss covers. This is where it comes from. So that means if they don't procure such a cat cover, their equity capital will be impacted seriously when things happen. Right? This is where the definition comes in. So what we look at the catastrophic disaster is we have to look at the financial. So if it goes beyond the financial resilience, we define that as a catastrophic disaster. That's why I'm saying we look at from 4 different angles. The first thing is the one event resulting in massive damages, bone injury, property damage, whatever, earthquake. So one event, massive damage. Secondly, the disaster cascade, from like earthquake to property injury, property damage, and from property damage into the financial losses or the relevant damage. It goes through the contractual relationship, supply chain, upstream, downstream, the business relationship. So it goes beyond. Right? So the impact is you have direct, indirect, it circles around. Right? So certainly, we have to look at the disaster in financial technology for that contingent liability. Right? Like for families, for businesses, for government, we all have contingent liability, which is an uncertain part, which is off balance sheet. But when it happens, it will consume the debt and the equity are on balance sheet. So you need a hedge against off-balance sheet hedge against off-balance sheet contingent liability. So insurance is one of the off-balance sheet contingent financing instrument which can be applied to do so. But thirdly, and most important, other people look at the individual residents and business to buy for that insurances with catastrophic events, which is not right. It is the job of the government, right? Because perception of these individuals massively different, and there's no way you can unite every single person together collectively to buy insurance for themselves, particularly in a country like China. There's no way you can do that. So it is the responsibility of the government to procure relevant insurance schemes to protect the government fiscal regime, right? To hedge the contingent liability, the fiscal contingent liability arising out of natural disaster, pandemic, and whatever. And even things like 911, terrorist attack, cyber attack. How to apply, the contingent financing instrument to close some of the gap. So yeah, the full angle. Thank you.
Just a quick question on that. Would that contingency financing be partially private?
Yes. Both, I think, but for contingent liability, motor vehicle insurance to hedge their off-balance sheet contingent liability for damage to property and third-party liability. And the businesses actually procure insurance, off-balance sheet capital, to hedge their off-balance sheet contingent liability running out of their operations in the property in the fixed. But the government also is the financial entity, and huge shortfall in the fund to deal with their responsibility, the rehabilitation of the water conservancy, the facilities, which is the liability of the government. But when things happen, they don't have money. So insurance, maybe some other hedging instrument may be served as part of the tools to be applied to the family, to the public, or to the future.
This goes pick up. That's basically what I studied in recent years of that. So that's exactly what you said. Okay, the next question is about Puerto Rico. He said the economic downturn or the snow growth of Puerto Rico, is it partially because of because of Latin America is not that much hot. So the United States does much attention on the Puerto Rico's economy.
I mean, I don't know, but I guess it's not a strategy not to be that concerned about Puerto Rico. I think it's a sense that it was doing fairly well through the 90s, 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so it wasn't in the same situation that it is today. The debt was managed growing. I think the downturn came, as you saw in the mid to late 2000s. I don't think it's a strategy. I think Latin America is important. In fact, I think Puerto Rico's position is sort of halfway between the United States and Latin America gives it some advantages. So it's a strategy, but the growth has been weak, and the takeover of the finances. This is fairly important. The idea that taking control from Puerto Rico of its finances as it did in 2006, as the federal government did in 2016, is a big step. But I think it was designed to help the situation. By the way, New York City faced the same situation. New York City was indebted. It had difficulty accessing the capital markets. It could not roll over its debt, and actually its finances were taken over by a controllable. So we point to that as these kinds of debt situations happen, but if they're handled well, you can come out strong, as New York City did. After a number of very difficult years and some difficult policies, New York City recovered and got back control of its finances to a large extent.
Thank you, Jim. Maybe there's one last question for you too. It's like when facing the extreme weather, right, under the condition of climate change, the developing countries and developed countries, do you see the different measure response to this kind of things, or do you have any suggestion or issues with this kind of two kind of countries, developing country and developed country? There are different response to the extreme weather.
Well, when I look at the models and the maps, it looks like a number of areas in development are at risk. I'm not sure exactly. I think the same principles apply. That is to try to get a sense of where the risks are. And resiliency, I think, is critical in those areas. To focus on policies that make the areas more resilient. Again, the models seem to say that sea level rise, there are a number of cities that are just at risk. And so resiliency measures would seem to be necessary, whether they can be financed, whether they should be, how they should be financed is an issue, but it looks like going forward, resiliency measures are going to be necessary in a number of these developing.
Our studies show both developed economies and emerging economies are prone to natural disasters. Interestingly, statistics shows that emerging economies, the impact of natural disasters to GDP of emerging economies is something in the range between 2% up to 2.8%. But to developed countries, only 0.8%. We see the resilience of the developed economies is much, much stronger in terms of engineering resilience, administrative resilience, and other resilience. They have much better infrastructure and a financial system to be resilient against a natural disaster. So that is why, all these international organizations like World Bank, ADB, IMF, are trying to set up programs to support less disadvantaged economies. For example, in the World Bank actually created we call that the pandemic emergency financing facility 4 years ago, to cover any pandemic events happening globally. Basically, they covered the 66 IDA countries, the poorest countries. But interestingly, the values for the pandemic parametric insurance underwritten by with two tranches of bond risks and 2 tranches of swaps. So totaling something like $400 million US dollar, $425 million US dollars. But this time, last year, I think last April, the parametric insurance under the bond actually was triggered. Only for $195 million US dollars, now which was disseminated to the poorest country. Well, yeah. So this is just one example. Like also World Bank supported like Mexico with their bond structuring, we call it fund and Hainan Fund, which is a mechanism, fiscal mechanism dealing with natural disasters, basically earthquake and precipitation rainfalls. So there are many programs initiated and managed by international organizations for disadvantaged economies.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dr. Wei. Thanks so much, Dr. James Orr. Thanks so much, Dr. Wei. It's a very, very insightful discussion talk. So that's it. I hope in the future we can have more discussion like this at our Hainan Youth Associations. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy it.